Welcome to the LowCarbMD podcast. No one is beyond help. No one is beyond hope.
As we have always said, we are bringing you medical information and cutting-edge science, but none of this is medical advice. Please seek out input from your own doctor.
Hello and welcome to the LowCarbMD podcast. We are Trolless this morning. He's doing research and all kinds of crazy stuff on this low carb stuff. But I have a guess. It's great we got to work this out last minute because this is a guy. Let me tell you. Let me do full disclosure here. I see a tweet on Twitter. I'm like, oh, this guy's a moron right off the start. That's my first thought. Why? Because he's doing the croissant diet, and I'm like, of course, it's a calorie restricted diet. You could eat bagels and eat 500 calories of bagels a day. You can eat 500 calories of gummy bears. And initially you're going to have weight loss, but does that mean it's healthy? So I started looking at his blog and I'm like, oh, this guy knows biochemistry. He has a big degree from Cornell. I guess that's a pretty good place, apparently. Sloan-Kettering, you're doing cancer research stuff. A programmer with Drosophila, right? The project looking at genetics. And also being a pig farmer for 15 years. And a chef on top of it. I'm just a doctor. So I'm like, I'm just a doc. This guy's got like 20 different things he's doing. But then I start looking at science. And then I listened to a podcast, which I would highly recommend, with Paul Saladino. Gosh darn, why am I blanking on the name of his podcast? Fundamental Health Podcast. And these guys go into the biochemistry in detail. So if you're into science and chemistry, and it's stuff that I was remembering from med school, I thought I would never use this biochemistry garbage. And then I realized, oh my gosh, these guys are really having an interesting discussion. So I think, Brad Marshall, I appreciate you coming on the podcast. And this is obviously going to be controversial for a lot of us. And also, I think we're going to learn a lot because I'm seeing things clinically, and I love your approach because it really theoretically it gives us answers to a lot of things that we've questioned over the years. So Brad, welcome. Tell people your story and how you got to where you are now.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. You kind of went into a lot of my background. I do have a biochemistry and genetics background from Cornell. And obviously I didn't stick with it forever. I got really interested in local foods and really got into that movement and came back to upstate New York, bought a farm, and I've been raising pigs for the last 15 years. And I've been running a butcher shop. And so that was a really interesting experience for me, and it sort of plays into the croissant diet in a lot of ways, because what I was able to do as a pig farmer was I had these different breeds of pig, and I could feed them different things. And I would notice when the pigs came back into the butcher shop that their fat would actually be firm or soft, depending on the breed of pig and what it was fed. And I thought, well, that's interesting. You know, what you feed an animal, and this has been known for a long time. You can read this in textbooks from the 1800s about how, you know, if you give pigs certain feeds, it makes their fat soft, and that was considered bad because it was too hard to slice it into bacon, you know, even way back in the day. And so, you know, you see that and you're like, wow, it turns out that the types of fats that we eat really affect our body, you know, in ways that other things don't. Like, you know, like if you eat a loaf of bread, you don't become made of gluten, right? Your body breaks down the gluten protein into individual amino acids, and it rebuilds its own proteins out of them. But I noticed that if you eat what happens in the pigs, if you feed them things that are oily like corn, the fat gets soft because those polyunsaturated fats, those vegetable oils in the corn, get stored in the body fat of the animal. And so it occurred to me that these polyunsaturated fats are really the only component in our diet that kind of like bioaccumulate. And the more that we eat of them, the more we are made of them. And that doesn't really happen. You know, if you eat starch, you don't store it as starch. Your body makes it into fat, and we store it as fat, and that fat can only be saturated or monounsaturated. We can't make polyunsaturated fats. And so that was kind of what I noticed as a pig farmer, as a butcher. And then as I worked in the butcher shop, I was busy all the time, and I've been a low carb guy forever. I mean, I read the Atkins book in like 2002 and was doing Atkins way back then. And I was busy in the butcher shop, and I wasn't being very good about my diet, and I was eating a lot of restaurant food because I was working all the time. And I realized, I think it was January of 2019, I realized I had become very overweight, and I stepped on the scale, and I weighed like 254 pounds or something, and I'm only 5'9". So, I'm a pretty barrel-chested guy, but still, that was an awful lot. So I'm a barrel-chested guy, but still, 254 pounds at 5'9" is an awful lot of weight, and I definitely had gained a lot of belly fat. And I tried doing keto, and I tried doing carnivore, and the weight just wasn't coming off like it did when I was 25, which isn't probably shocking to a lot of people. And so I thought, I've got to do something about this. And I've long had an interest in a blog called Hyperlipid. It's written by a guy named Peter Dombrowski. I'm sure I didn't pronounce his last name right. And so I started rereading that blog, and, Peter's a really smart guy, but his blog is very dense. It's very dense with biochemistry, and he doesn't define any of the jargon he's using. He just jumps right into it. You just have to figure it out. It's like a sink or swim kind of thing. And so I thought, maybe I should actually figure this out. And so I spent a lot of the spring of 2019 digging through reading through his blog, reading all the papers that he's linking to, and learning this jargon. And all of a sudden I realized, I was like, okay, this makes a lot of sense. And I actually ended up writing what I call the layperson's guide to hyperlipid on my blog, Fire in a Bottle, which I also call the ROS Theory of Obesity. And I'm going to give you the real nutshell version of that theory, because I think, I know you want to talk about some clinical stuff. Let me try to summarize it without getting too deep in the weeds on the biochemistry, but the basic idea is this. We have a very evolutionarily conserved mechanism. It's been conserved for over 1 billion years. It goes all the way back. C. elegans, a tiny nematode, which is a little worm that lives in the dirt, has the same mechanism. And the mechanism is this. When our mitochondria are burning saturated fat, it produces something called reactive oxygen species, which is a type of free radical, I'm going to say a bunch of scary words in a row. So when we're burning saturated fat, our body produces free radicals. And what those free radicals do is they actually, they end up disabling several of the key molecules involved in insulin signaling. And so the free radicals actually make a cell insulin resistant. And so specifically, where does this happen? Well, when we eat dietary fat, it's actually targeted at specific organs and specific tissues that are making a lot of a protein called LPL, which is the thing that basically, as our, the dietary fat is absorbed in these things called chylomicrons, and that's how it moves through the blood to the tissues, and those chylomicrons basically dock wherever LPL is, and those tissues start burning the dietary fat. And so if you eat a lot of dietary saturated fat, it ends up going straight to your abdominal fat, interestingly. And so if you eat a meal high in saturated fat, your abdominal fat cells start burning it. And when they do that, they create these reactive oxygen species, and insulin, therefore, doesn't have as big of an effect on your abdominal fat tissues. They're a little bit insulin resistant. And now this is called physiological insulin resistant. This is very different from sort of long-term diabetes. This is a short-term reversible insulin resistant that only happens when these tissues are burning saturated fat. And so insulin, I think, is a very misunderstood thing. We understand it a lot in the context of type 1 diabetes and think that its job is to sort of push blood glucose into tissues, but really at much lower concentrations than it does that, what it does is it tells your fat cells to stop releasing fat through a process called lipolysis. So insulin is telling your fat cells not to release any fat to the rest of the body as fuel. And so when you eat saturated fat, it goes basically straight to your abdominal tissue or your abdominal fat tissue and creates these free radicals. And so they ignore insulin, and so they keep releasing fat for the body. That, in a nutshell, is the mechanism, described in Hyperlipid that I read, and that was what gave me the idea to try this croissant diet. I said, well, if that's right, if that theory is correct, it means that maybe the root of the problem of my obesity is not, in fact, the carbohydrate. Maybe it's the type of fats that I'm eating. And maybe if I change those fat ratios, I can actually sort of use this dietary saturated fat to force myself to lose weight. And so I tried it, and it worked. And so, I lost, I started making these croissants that were very high, very, very high. I bought some commercial stearic acid, which is, to be clear, stearic acid is just a long chain sad fat. It's naturally high in beef fat. It's somewhat high in beef fat. It's very, very high in beef kidney fat or beef suet. It's very high in cocoa butter. It's somewhat high in dairy products. Anyways, so it is available in a lot of natural sources, but I was actually making these croissants. Croissants are about, people think of croissants, I think, probably as being very high carbohydrate, but actually about 70% of the calories in croissants are from fat. And so you're only getting maybe 25% of the calories as carbohydrate. And so I was thinking about using the starch in the croissants as basically a delivery vessel for these long chain saturated fats. And so I was using a mixture of butter, which is already fairly saturated, and I was adding more saturated fat to it. And what I noticed was this immediate, I did lose some pounds, but I noticed an immediate shrinking of my waist and my belly and my pants getting looser, and we kind of touched on this before the show, but I saw, I lost like 4 or 5 inches off my waist, and I really only lost about 15 pounds total. And so, I could see that the effects of what I was doing seemed very dramatically targeted at abdominal fat. And that's interesting because a lot of the science on Hyperlipid and on my blog, if you go read the ROS Theory of Obesity, is done in rodents. But one of the things you see in rodent models, so there was a paper that I got the initial idea. It was a thesis by a woman called Valerie Reeves, and she was feeding mice basically starch and sugar and stearic acid, and they got very lean, but specifically they had very low amounts of abdominal fat. And so you can kind of see in these rodent models that the rodents given a lot of saturated fat have very small amounts of abdominal fat. And so one of the things that I like about this is, you mentioned I have a chef background, and I love food history, and I love cooking. And so I've always, one of the things, even as I've known, or even as I've been doing, ketogenic diets all these years, on and off, I always knew in the back of my mind that the traditional French diet is this diet based on butter and baguettes in things like croissants. And so the French are eating a lot of saturated fat, and they're eating it with starch, and they're eating it with sugar. And traditionally, they remained lean. You know, and so this is always a question I had in my mind. I'm like, how is this possible? How do I resolve this kind of cognitive dissonance of thinking that if I need to lose weight, I need to go ketogenic, but I know that the French are eating something entirely different and they remain lean. And so when I read the hyperlipid and started thinking about the science and the biochemistry, that's when I started thinking, like, maybe Peter has come up with the thing that explains why the ketogenic diet could work on the one hand, but it also explains why the French diet works on another hand, because, you know, by minimizing, you know, and so to be clear, so what makes the diet work? Well, two things. One is maximizing the amount of saturated fat that you're eating, but the other thing is minimizing the amount of these polyunsaturated fats. And so the polyunsaturated fats are, you know, the vegetable oils, corn oil, soybean oil, canola oil, etc. And those were the fats that I was seeing accumulate in the pigs when I fed them corn. Those are the fats that I saw making the pork fat soft. And as you probably realize, most of you, soybean oil is a quite liquidy thing. If you put soybean oil in your refrigerator, it remains a liquid. But if you put beef fat in the refrigerator, it's quite solid. And that's because polyunsaturated fats are very liquidy. I've got an article on my blog called the Hows, Whats, and Whys of Fat, I think, and you can see why plants make these liquid fats and animals make solid fats. But what I saw was all of these places that these polyunsaturated fats are coming into our diet, and then we're storing them. And the thing about the polyunsaturated fats is that the polyunsaturated fats don't generate the reactive oxygen species in the mitochondria. And so if your abdominal fat cells are burning polyunsaturated fats, they remain insulin sensitive. And we're talking about specifically just your abdominal fat cells. And when your abdominal fat cells are insulin sensitive, what happens is every time that you produce insulin, they stop releasing fat, and they do it for a long time. They can you know, insulin can reduce the amount of fat available for your body to burn for at least 8 hours. That people have tracked it in various studies. And so what happens is, when you think about it, so you eat a meal, insulin comes along, you know, your blood sugar maybe goes up. But even a ketogenic meal, you know, if you're eating steak, you're still going to produce insulin, and your abdominal fat cells are still going to be, you know, depending on how many stored PUFAs you have and how much stored polyunsaturated fat, and depending on the kind of octane of fuel they're burning, if they're very responsive to insulin, they're going to shut off releasing fat to the body for the next potentially 8 hours or longer. And so that's why, you know, I think that's one of the big reasons why a lot of people, you know, you eat a meal and 3 or 4 hours later, you're starving again. You know, you feel like you should be full, but what happens is your blood sugar comes back down after 3 hours. So that goes away. And now if your fat cells are too insulin sensitive, your free fatty acids, which is the other main, well, one of the other main sources of circulating fuel, are also lower than baseline. So you can actually end up 3 hours after a meal with actually less fuel available to your cells than before you ate, because you ate the meal and because insulin told your fat cells to stop feeding the body. And so that really is at the heart of the whole concept, is this idea that we want our abdominal fat cells to continue to release fat for the body. And the way that we do that is we keep them in this kind of mild state of insulin resistance.
Yeah, and that's the amazing part, because for me, I'm Jason Fung devotee, whatever, right? And so when I look, I'm like, our whole role of what we're doing with the ketogenic diet, low carb, is to make our body more sensitive to insulin. I never thought about the fat cells saying we want to make them insulin resistant at the same time we're making the rest of the body insulin sensitive. So we want to shift that energy from storage to either keeping it in the bloodstream or putting it into the muscle tissue, right? So that's why when you started talking, I was, from a clinical perspective now, obviously the biochemistry, you guys are, it's definitely worth listening to Dr. Saladino's podcast that you did. So from a clinical perspective, I sit back and think, okay, if I want to make my fat cells insulin resistant, right? There's a whole topic, and maybe you could touch a little bit about it for people who aren't familiar with linoleic acid versus stearic acid, and why that is critical to what we're talking about.
Yeah, and so the whole, again, I don't want to delve too deeply in the biology, but yes, stearic acid is a long-chain saturated fat. Palmitic acid is the other major long-chain saturated fat. And linoleic acid is that main PUFA or polyunsaturated fat that's in, soybean oil. It's in canola oil, but guess what? It's also in, and this is one of my big talking points, it's also in chicken fat and pork fat because of what we feed the monogastric animals. Cows do a kind of cool thing where if you feed them vegetable oil, they turn, well, the bugs, they live in their rumen, turn much of it into saturated fat like stearic acid and palmitic acid. Chickens and pigs do not. Chickens and pigs are what you feed them. And so I think people would be surprised to know that most chicken produced in the US has more polyunsaturated fat than canola oil, and most pork fat produced in the US has about the same amount of linoleic acid, polyunsaturated fat, omega-6, as does canola oil. And so I think we've got these Trojan horses of these polyunsaturated fats. And so what they're doing biochemically is they are keeping our abdominal fat cells insulin sensitive. As Peter, the author of the blog Hyperlipid, would say, linoleic acid keeps your abdominal fat cells pathologically insulin sensitive.
Yeah, so that's a huge point. That's a huge point, because clinically, as a clinician, I sit back and I'm making observation, and so I love what you did observation-wise. You're like seeing these skinny Frenchmen, and I've observed that all this time. I have an obese, I don't want to say I have an obese wife. My wife's very fit, but patient, the wife and the husband are there. The wife's obese, and she goes, I eat 6 times a day. She's doing all this stuff. You need to talk to my husband. He's skinny and fit. And he goes, I only eat twice a day, and he puts butter on all this stuff. And I'm like, this is interesting. It's always intrigued me. Like, he should go into starvation mode, because we've been told you have to eat 6 times a day. The problem is when you eat 6 times a day, you're spiking your insulin 6 times a day, which Jason Fung is absolutely correct on. So if you skip breakfast, what are you doing? You're relying on your fat storage. You drop your insulin to the lowest level, right, when you wake up in the morning. So when you have low insulin, you say, okay, let's let my glucagon, the insulin suppressing glucagon, which is going to release some of that fat and glycogen, right? So to run on energy. So what's intriguing about your stuff is this. It explains the French paradox. It's not really a paradox, because if what you're saying is true, it makes sense. It's not a paradox that they're having lower heart disease and strokes and all this kind of stuff and eating a high saturated fat diet, and they're skinny. And we see obesity as a huge problem, but we have to look at the biochemistry, and we have to understand what we're doing. So all of us who've been obese in our life, what have we done? We switch over to lean chicken. I'm just going to have chicken. I'm going to have chicken. And so stay away from red meat and butter. Now you're saying, saturated fat may be helping the process, and we've been ingrained for years to not eat saturated fat. So then you say, okay, let me step back and look. And I had to reflect on what I was learning from you, is saying, okay, these carnivores, I've noticed improved mood, improved energy, lean muscle mass improvements, loss of visceral fat. I'm like, how can this be? They're eating a ton of saturated fat. Now I say, well, it kind of makes sense. The stuff that I've seen, but I couldn't understand, now it says, well, from that perspective, and I watch my friend Rob Seibis putting butter on top of his steak, and I think, idiot, right? Idiot, because you don't need to put more fat in your diet. If you're trying to lose fat, you want to burn your own fat. Why are you putting saturated fat? And then you say, I've told people, look, this whole, fat bombs, and I'll tell you why I say this clinically. Fat bombs and bulletproof coffee, I'm like, why add calories? Just fast in the morning, and then you get to your, but it makes sense if you're looking from this whole stearic acid to linoleic acid and your experience. And another clinical thing that I've seen is I have a lady, she did keto a year and a half ago, lost 19 pounds in the first 4 weeks. Now I have her in a very controlled environment. And what was she doing? And now she's lost 10 pounds in the first 6 weeks. I'm like, I'm half as successful as we were a year and a half ago. So I'm telling myself, well, it must be because, well, she has a history of gastric bypass, which complicates things. So she can't eat as much at one sitting. So I'm thinking, what is the difference? I sat down with her, I go, look, we're not having a heck of a lot of success right now. 10 pounds is a lot in 6 weeks, but based on her previous experience, I'm thinking your body just wants to hold on to fat, doesn't want to give it up. And I said, what's the difference between what we're doing now and what you did before? She said, well, back then I was having fat bombs all the time. And because I was trying to get to my 70% fat in my diet. I'm like, well, burn your own fat. Don't add fat to the system when you're trying to burn fat. It makes logical sense. And so I said, well, let's liberalize the fat intake a little bit and see what happens, because now there's two different schools of thought clinically, is that we say, well, we have the Ted Naiman approach where you say it's the protein energy ratio. And you're saying, oh, saturated fat is going to tell your fat cells not to keep storing fat. We're looking at, and then you say, well, okay, do I do a low carb diet? And so I think the question, I have a ton of questions for you, but one comes to mind is like, okay, if I'm running at a calorie deficit and I'm not storing that stearic acid in my fat cells because I'm shutting it off by, I'm using up that energy and keeping it in the system. You see the point? It's kind of an interesting, is it that you have to eat at a calorie excess and have the saturated fat to be storing in your fat cells to change the dynamics or is that just a local phenomenon that happens right away?
Yeah, well, I think the system is very dynamic, right? And so you've got all these different things that are happening after a meal. It's like right. Ultimately, at the end of the day, of course, it's calories in, calories out. But, that doesn't always, we can't always make logical decisions about the best thing to do based on that sort of like fundamental, like physical fact, right? So it's like, all right, well, what is going to cause me to stay satiated the longest after the meal so that I don't need to eat again? What's gonna allow my, what's going to literally allow my fat cells to keep releasing fat. But so let's talk about your concept of, you're overweight. You probably have a ton of stored linoleic acid, because you're an American and we all do. We've all eaten at you go to the restaurant and you get, the sauteed vegetables, or you buy eggs, and of course they're all cooked in soybean oil, right? So so restaurants are another kind of Trojan horse of soybean oil. Salads, you're like, well, I want to be low carb, so I order the salad, and of course it's drenched in soybean oil. Or you get, so anyways, so you've got all this stored polyunsaturated fats. You sleep overnight. In the morning, you are burning your own fat, but it's pretty unsaturated, which is to say your fat cells are going to be pretty insulin sensitive. Now you eat that lean chicken breast. Well, what's going to happen? Your body's going to produce insulin in response to that protein. Now the insulin is going to go to your fat cells. They're going to respond. They're going to respond by reducing the amount of fat that they're releasing, right? That's what they're going to do. And so now, couple hours after you eat that chicken breast, you're going to be hungry again because your fat cells are no longer releasing fat. And that's, I think that's pretty, that's been pretty well studied. There's a great study on my blog where they, in Spain, where they give 3 different meals to these test volunteers. One group gets butter, one group gets olive oil, and another one gets polyunsaturated fats. I really like this study. And you can see they have the graph of what happens to the free fatty acids, which is the fats in your bloodstream that you have available to burn immediately, basically. And the group that gets the butter, you know, their free fatty acids drop initially after the meal, as they should in a metabolically healthy person, but then very quickly they bounce back. And so by, I think, 3 or 4 hours after the meal, the group that ate the butter has higher circulating free fatty acids, you know, not by a lot, but by 10% more, you know, so they actually have more energy available to them because they ate the butter. The group that gets the olive oil, they have less energy available to them than before they ate, you know, 4 hours after the meal. And the group that gets the vegetable oil has even less energy availability. So I really do think there's something to this idea that the saturation level and the amount of fat that you're eating is really affecting what's happening in those fat cells. And I'll tell you, this is another thing that I touch on my blog, and I want to write a lot more about this in the future because I think this is very interesting. If you look sort of at what obese people are doing, and in addition to the fact that they have a lot of stored polyunsaturated fat, the main gene involved in a lot of this energy regulation that is overproduced in very obese people is a gene called SCD1 or stearoyl dehydrogenase, I think. And what it does is it turns saturated fats into monounsaturated fats. And so this gene, its literal only job is turning, you know, stearic acid into oleic acid, which is the fat in olive oil. That's all it does. And so if you look, obese people very obese people make something like 3 or 4 times as much of this gene. So their fat is really very, very unsaturated. And I have an article on this, I think it's called "The Fat of Obese People is Highly Unsaturated" on the ROS Theory of Obesity thread. And when they look at other genes that are changed or their regulation is changed that have to do with fat metabolism in obese people, they really don't see any difference. Really, the main one that changes is this gene, and all it's doing is causing your fat to be less saturated. And interestingly, if you make a knockout mouse that lacks this gene, so if mice can't unsaturate their stearic acid into oleic acid, they have lifetime protection against obesity. You know, you might be able to overwhelm that by feeding them a bunch of soybean oil or something, but in a typical kind of low-fat mice diet, if they can't unsaturate their fat, they have lifetime protection against obesity and diabetes. And so, you know, you see that in humans, people who are obese are unsaturating their fat, and you see in mice that mice who can't unsaturate their fat always remain lean and never get diabetes. And in fact, they become more insulin sensitive on a whole body level. They have lower blood sugar, and their muscle cells are much better at taking up and using glucose due to the fact that their fat is highly saturated. And so there's a lot of different data points coming in suggesting that there is something to this. And so again, when we think about what the mechanism here is really, it's about ratios. You know, it's about how much saturated fat, how much monounsaturated fat, and how much polyunsaturated fat. And just to be clear, all right, what does a healthy human fat look like? Let's say some of the listeners might not love this concept, but let's say that we're in a society where we're eating mostly starch. It's a Chinese society, and we're eating sweet potatoes, which have almost no polyunsaturated fat in them, very, very little, plenty enough to prevent any kind of deficiency disease or anything like that. But most of your fat is starch. What the human body, by what it will tend to do if it's doing de novo lipogenesis from eating starch, is it's going to store your fat as roughly half saturated and roughly half monounsaturated, with maybe 2 or 3% of polyunsaturated fat. And interestingly, that's very similar to what a beef cow stores its body fat as. That's very similar to the fat that's on a ribeye steak. And if you take a pig and you don't feed it any, if you just feed it starch and you don't feed it any polyunsaturated fats, which is what I'm doing over at Firebrand Meats, then the fat of the pig will be a very similar composition to human fat from humans just eating starch, and will be very similar to beef fat. And so to me, that suggests that this is probably a biologically relevant ratio. You know, the fact that we see it in all these different places, this basically 50-50 of saturated and monounsaturated fat. And so I think, you know, and the problem is now, right, we're walking around with all this stored polyunsaturated fats, and at any time we're burning a blend of our stored body fat and our dietary fat. And so that's why when I did the croissant diet, I was thinking, well, I want to use these fat ratios to try to, you know, lose weight, but I know that my stored body fat is going to be high in polyunsaturated fats. I know that since I've been an obese person, I probably make a lot of SCD1, the gene that is unsaturating my fat. And so I was thinking I need to overwhelm, I need to basically overwhelm the body fat that I have now by eating lots of fat and eating lots of highly saturated fat. And, you know, so far, so good, I guess. I still have more weight to lose, but, you know, I'm down about 35 pounds now from where I was in the spring of 2019. So there's been some ups and downs. I gained the COVID 10 back and had to re-lose that, and you know.
Yeah, those things are going to happen for sure. And plus you're a wine drinker too, so that may play a role in you know, and which is interesting is that you're drinking wine and you're losing. And when you're saying belly fat, you're talking about visceral fat, I assume.
I'm talking about visceral fat. Yeah, I'm talking about abdominal fat. Like I'm now wearing jeans jean sizes that I haven't been able to wear for 20 years, you know.
Yes. And that ties into exactly my question. This is something I've been posting on Twitter recently, doing mostly medical weight loss, you know, metabolic disease stuff. I'm seeing this, and I'm reaching out to people, and Dr. O'Meara has some MRI studies showing that as people decrease their visceral fat without exercise, their abdominal muscle mass is going up. So visceral fat must play some role in inhibiting muscle mass. And here's my theory. This is what I'm thinking. Okay, if I'm a bear and I'm going to hibernate for 4 to 6 months, I want to add fat on, right? If I want to keep my fat and I want to be able to hibernate through the winter, I want to decrease my muscle mass at the same time, because muscle mass is metabolically active tissue. So what are they eating? A lot of linoleic acid in their nuts, right? Eating
right.
And fruit, and and I was correct. I don't know if this is true, but one of my patients who studies bears apparently said that they eat the skin off the outside of the salmon and they throw the rest of it back because they're trying to get the fat, the carbs, all this stuff together, and then they get fat. So this visceral fat has to play. And the reason I'm saying this is I'm seeing some people, a fair amount of people, who will lose inches. One of my guys, as a matter of fact, I thought it was a confounder, because it is a confounder too, but he came off of a liquid diet. Basically, he just couldn't take it anymore. He was losing his mind. He was upset with everyone and short-tempered and starving all the time. So he had already lost 44, almost 45 pounds by the time he came to me. And I said, this is going to be tough because you've lost a lot of muscle mass. You've been in a starvation mode. So if you go ketogenic and I give you 2,000 calories a day, you're probably going to gain weight for the first, until we get you fat adapted. Interestingly enough, even with the weight loss, his insulin level is elevated and it's dropping like crazy on a ketogenic diet. So what I'm seeing is he goes, look, doc, his weight stayed stable for 5 weeks. And the thing is, he's losing inches. He's wearing the same, he's at 220 pounds or so, and he's wearing pants that he was when he was 180 pounds. So I'm seeing massive drops in his visceral fat because I'm monitoring on a machine that does body composition. So I'm like, you're losing a ton of visceral fat. You're down 5 inches and you're hardly losing weight. Now he's lost 11 pounds in the last 2 weeks. So something's happening, and I don't know. And this is why I was reaching out about this question, because I think a lot of people give up on a diet because they're not seeing this. They're looking at the scale as their only marker, right? So for you, you lost inches in excess of, if you lose 15 pounds but lose 5 inches, that is that's a discrepancy. That doesn't make sense, right? I mean, that's visceral fat, and that's what we worry about. From me as a doctor, visceral fat scares me more than anything. Having a lot of visceral fat, you don't want that. But what I'm seeing is, so that's one guy. And another patient of mine, kind of the same thing, put her on fat bombs and add fat to her diet, and she's doing better. And I think there's an individual variance, but another case that really, it was killing my brain, diabetic, sugars out of control. He's on crazy amount of medication to control his sugars. Put him on low carb, keto diet. And he has 11.3 liters of visceral fat. So he has a lot of visceral fat. A lot of my patients have 2 to 3. He has 11.3. His wife is, 180 pounds, maybe, a lot of underlying muscle mass. They're doing the same diet. Basically, she's not as strict. He's extremely strict. She loses 6.5 pounds the first week. He loses 2 pounds. And he has a ton of fat to lose. But he said, my clothes are fitting better. And over time, we're seeing he's losing a lot of inches, but less visceral fat. So I'm thinking he must be losing, and I'm seeing it. I haven't checked his body composition yet, but I can see he's losing visceral fat, but his body mass is staying pretty, it's dropping slowly, right? For the amount of inches we're seeing him lose inches. So I'm thinking there has to be some kind of an energy that it's either more energy or it's more difficult to get rid of visceral fat because his wife doesn't have as much visceral fat. So maybe she's burning more peripheral fat. So there must be some kind of a difference in either the visceral fat is more calorie dense, meaning you have to lose more of it to see pounds drop, versus peripheral fat, right? And so I'm looking at that, and then I saw your stuff and I go, this makes sense in a way, or this guy may just be so, his fat is so insulin sensitive, it doesn't want to give up the fat. So it's going to take him longer to get into a ketosis or into a fat burning mode where we can see it, other than his wife, who's metabolically healthier, but she's gained weight because she's had such a terrible diet.
Right.
Does that make sense? That sometimes clinically we're seeing this, and I'm thinking there's something to this. And if the visceral fat is preventing you from putting muscle mass on, we got to get rid of a certain percentage of that visceral fat. And this may also explain plateaus where your body's like getting rid of some visceral fat, then it switches over to peripheral. Then it says, okay, I'm going to go back to visceral fat for a while. Then I don't know how all that works, but it seems clinically that would make sense of why we see some people drop weight really quickly and other people, depending on their metabolic health, lose weight at different rates. What do you think?
Well, so I think that fat storage is a lot more dynamic than we maybe give it credit for. I think that fat cells are releasing, they're doing lipolysis and releasing their fat as free fatty acids all the time. And I think that, and that's, like I say, that's mostly happening hours after you've eaten. They stop doing that in response to insulin, but then, they start back up again fairly quick. And I think that those free fatty acids are getting repackaged in the liver as things like VLDL, and then that VLDL is going in the blood. And I think, the fat cells are reuptaking it and restoring it again. So I think you have this kind of constant conveyor belt of fats moving around the body. And so I think that the degree to which saturated fat targets the visceral fat, I think the visceral fat keeps giving off fat and not reuptaking it. And so it could well be that by switching to saturated fat, something is happening where basically the visceral fat is dumping fat, and it might be getting picked up in your I'm a pig farmer, so I want to call it back fat, but your subcutaneous fat. There could be some amount of that going on, just kind of like moving it around. But then I also think that, and it might just take a longer to burn off, burn off the calories as opposed to that initial kind of body reconfiguration. But I think that, like you say, over time, visceral fat does tend to be where you see a lot of the inflammation and perhaps some of the other problems. And so I think, it really, well, and it also psychologically, when you start a diet, if you quick drop a pant size, it makes you feel good, even if, even if the scale isn't coming down as fast as you want. So there's
Well,
some
I think that what I've been talking about is, look, the scale's the worst marker we have. Like you're saying, let's measure your inches and see, let's look at your visceral fat. And I have the ability to do that. So I love it, because I have people that are losing a couple of pounds. I go, look, you lost 2 liters of visceral fat. Like, we have that documented, and we can see that, right?
Right.
And we're seeing insulin levels. Like, one of my patients, he just posted on Twitter yesterday, and his A1C 3-month sugar average went from 10.2 to 6.7 in 70 days, right? With not that much weight loss. He's lost maybe, 12 pounds or something like that. And he's a pretty good sized guy. But the point is, he's so much metabolically healthier now, but it's not like he had to lose 30 pounds to get metabolically healthier. His insulin level is normalizing. All of it, he's coming off meds, and his A1C is coming down at the same time, and he's healthier, and he's mostly carnivore, right? He's eating a higher saturated fat. And so I'm seeing this, and he's losing inches too. You could tell.
Right.
So very intriguing. I think the take home is, look, don't let the scale be your marker. So many people, they're weighing themselves 3 times a day, and they're stressing out. They're spiking their stress hormones. They're doing all this stuff. And those people who lose the least amount of weight, the ones who say and as a matter of fact, I just saw a post this morning about that, saying the people who worry, they change their diet to lose weight, do worse than people who do it for health, just to be healthier, right?
Well, and the other huge variable is, of course, the amount of glycogen that you store and the water weight associated with that. And I think that can go up and down all the time. So just relying on the scale can make you crazy. I tell everybody, look, go buy if you go to a drugstore and ask for a sewing tape measure, they're flexible, they're easy, they're cost like $3, and you can check your waist with them. And I think that's a much more interesting and reliable source of progress sometimes than the scale can be. And I've got an interesting, so a woman, people have been very interested in this story, but there was a woman who reached out to me, and she said, she had been for like 6 years, she wasn't hugely overweight, but a lot heavier than she wanted to be. And she had been doing ketogenic diet for about 6 years, and she was strict carnivore for about 2 years. And she'd failed to lose a single ounce even, in this whole 6-year trial. And she read my thing, and she realized that, she'd been eating a lot of pork and chicken, and she didn't like beef. It didn't really agree with her. And she read my thing. And so she switched over to getting a lot of her fat from a combination of cocoa butter and butter, I think, mixed together, was what she was using as her fat source. And I think she still didn't like the beef. So I think she continued to eat lean chicken, but supplementing with a lot of highly saturated fats with a lot of stearic acid. And she said for the first time, the scale started to drop. And she said at first it was only by grams, she said tiny amounts of weight loss at first, but at least it was going down, and she'd never seen that before. And then she said that after she stuck with it for like 3 or 4 months, her weight loss actually started to accelerate. And all of a sudden it all just came off, and she actually dropped below her target weight. And that's on my blog. It's just called Emmy's Story. And then she said that now, and that was only maybe from 2 months ago, but she said now even her after photo on the Emmy's Story doesn't do it justice, because she's lost so much more weight. And that was after struggling. And that was after doing, pretty strict carnivore for over 2 years. But she was eating pork fat and chicken fat.
Yeah, exactly. And so you start looking at it that way. And so, and as a matter of fact, just in what you're saying is I do a lot of medical volunteer work, and I was in Guatemala, and I actually spent some time in Cuba, and their chicken is totally different than our chicken. If I'm cooking the chicken, I'm barbecuing the chicken, I'm telling my buddy who's Guatemalan, and I'm like, hey man, there's something wrong with this chicken. It's really cooking weird. And he's like, no, that's how it is here. It's like very white, very different color than what we see. And it was excellent, really good. He's like, yeah, because he goes, the difference in time is about 3 weeks from all the chemicals you guys give to let them eat bugs or whatever they do there. it's not that big of a difference in time, but we have to crank it out for our food supply. So you start thinking about that, like what you're feeding your animals and how we're magnifying that in our diet too, right?
Yeah, and what I see in having been in farming for 15 years, you know, there's absolute groupthink in the sort of nutritional, like livestock nutrition people and feed mills even, and it doesn't matter if they're local organic mills or if they're non-GMO. You know, the livestock nutritionists are all taught at Ohio State, you have to feed supplemental soybean oil to chickens because it gets them to market 3 days faster. And when you go to the feed mills ask the nutritionist, and the nutritionists say, well, you have to give the chickens 5% supplemental soybean oil. And that's just what it is. You almost can't buy chicken feed in the US that doesn't have some type of supplemental soybean oil in it. And that's on top of a diet that's already made of corn, which is already reasonably high in polyunsaturated fats. And it's a very hard business to change because of just the nature of how the people in that industry think. And so I'm coming at it from another angle and saying we have to fix this, and that's why I formed Firebrand Meats, and I am selling low PUFA pork, but I'm also I just kind of want it to be an incubator for ideas and talking about this and how we have a lot of problems if we want to produce better meat in this country. One of my key issues that I love to talk about all the time is just lack of local affordable slaughter options. If you want to raise better pork out there, I can't tell you how hard it is to find USDA processing. And with all, the industry is consolidated. There are huge, massive scale industrial slaughterhouses. They're not going to work with local farmers trying to make a better product. And then there's mom and pop shops, and the mom and pop shops are they just don't have the capacity to produce on any kind of scale. And so it leaves you as a farmer in this kind of you can only be tiny. It's hard to get to be a medium-sized farm, and that keeps the costs really high. And so this is a real crisis, and I don't have answers, but I want to keep talking about the problem.
It's the same problem we have too, right? As a matter of fact, I'll tell you, one of my guys recently, the same guy, as a matter of fact, just turns out to be, he's doing great, keto, low carb. Last week he had one bun on his hamburger, spiked his sugars, pretty significantly just with that one bun on his hamburger rather than having it protein style. But this week he's had this spike. I say, hey, what was that? Because I can see their continuous glucose monitors.
Right.
That's so weird. He goes, I don't get that one. He said, all I had a huge lunch and it didn't spike at all because he did mostly meat. And at dinner, he said, I was with family, so my sister-in-law made some salad, so I just had salad. And I said, were there croutons in it? No. Was it this? Was that? We went through all the stuff. And he said, no, I had water with it. And I said, what was it? What kind of dressing? And he said, I don't know. And I go, I bet you it was soybean oil or sugar added to that because it spiked it pretty darn good. And how many people Tucker Goodrich was talking about that, and Kate Shanahan, who we had on the podcast, talking about the linoleic acid in the fat stores. And I didn't really grab exactly what they were talking about other than knowing that seed oils are bad. But then you start saying, oh, all of us who've been on a diet have said, okay, I'm just going to have chicken instead of steak. That's my leaning too, is saying, okay, I'm going to cut out the carbohydrates and I'm going to eat low to moderate fat type thing and eat a lot of protein. So then you start saying, are we doing ourselves a disservice if we have a lot of linoleic acid that's going to prevent us from losing fat by cutting our fat? It's maddening as a doctor, because what have we told people? Eat 6 times a day, never skip breakfast, you're going to go into starvation mode. Don't eat saturated fat, stay away from butter. And the other thing that this ties into clinically is the Minnesota Heart Study. Right? They took away their butter and they gave them margarine. Their LDL went down, but they had increased event rates. But no one wanted to talk about that because they didn't understand it. So if what you're saying is true, then you start sitting back saying, and if the French are not having heart attacks at a rate, even eating a ton of saturated fat, it's like, right? Right? Have we been giving bad advice this whole time?
As Peter, again, from Hyperlipid is fond of saying, when he talks about, when he talks about the obesity epidemic, he frequently says, "Thank your cardiologist," because it was the cardiologists were the ones who promoted the vegetable oils in the first place, and why we're now awash in them. So that it's an interesting message, but
yeah, and along those lines too, one of the thing is fasting. We all know this with the energy model with Dave Feldman is if you're fasting, your LDL goes up, right? Because your body's kicking fat out of it. So if you're losing weight, your LDL goes up because you're kicking fat out of your fat stores and you're seeing it in the bloodstream. It's not your total body cholesterol, but it's what we're seeing in the bloodstream. So my first thought with eating more stearic acid is that's going to remain in the bloodstream longer because it's not being taken up by the fat cells.
Exactly.
And if I check your blood, I'm going to say, oh my gosh, you're going to die. Because your LDL is going to be crazy, right? It's going to be high, and your triglycerides are probably going to be
your triglycerides are going to be high. And so in the Spanish butter study that I talk about in my thing, not necessarily forever. Maybe you wouldn't see it in fasting the next day, but in the high butter meal, the triglycerides stay high stay above baseline for at least 8 hours after people ate butter. So that's sending your triglycerides up, right? But let's think about that for a second. So on the study, triglycerides are going to measure the amount of fat in your chylomicrons, which is the way that your intestine absorbs fat and sends it around the body, right? And so you eat fat, your chylomicrons goes up. On a blood test, that's going to come out as triglycerides. Okay, fine. So the butter group, the triglycerides stay high for a very long time. The olive oil and the vegetable oil groups, the triglycerides come back down to baseline much quicker, right? So they had circulating fat in the blood, and then it was cleared. So where did that fat go? Guess what? They stored it as body fat. The butter group didn't. So in the butter group, 8 hours later, it's still circulating around, being used as energy. In the vegetable oil group, by 6 hours, it had all been stored as body fat. So that to me is really interesting when you look at the dynamics of how the triglycerides look after a meal. It's like, where did they go?
They go into your fat cells, right? Or you're burning.
Yeah, exactly. It's in your fat cells. And I have no reason to believe that those groups, actually burned those extra calories faster. I think they just stored it as fat.
Yeah, and that's what's really interesting about all this stuff. That's why it's thought provoking. I think it does warrant further investigation and taking a look and saying, okay, what's the long-term effects? What, obviously we have to look at the risks and benefits of everything we do. And so I think these are the big take-home messages for us, is saying, okay, how do we reevaluate this? If someone's plateaued out, they may consider, let's do fat bombs and see what happens. Now, from your standpoint, if people are going to do fat bombs, or they're going to do like bulletproof coffee type thing, the question becomes MCT oil combined with stearic acid or with butter. What would you say is like, because at some point, there's people who've made the mistake of drinking bulletproof coffee all day. They have 12 glasses of 12 cups of
sure.
They're not losing weight, right? So at some point, there's a return on investment where it becomes you're putting too much energy into the system.
Yeah, and so of course, I do think that calories matter. I'm not going to say that they don't matter, but I don't think thinking of it in a calories matter way is the right way to think about it, though. I think we need to be thinking about like what gives me satiation, when should I be eating, and I would say, anything that helps you eat to satiation is great. I'm gonna share another anecdote. So this was literally emailed to me last night at 10 p.m. and I didn't see it right away, so I only just read it. But this is a guy who read my blog. He's a pretty big guy. He's a 35-year-old male. He's 6'6" tall, and he was 270 pounds in June. And I think this is really interesting because his experience match a lot of my experience trying the same thing. He says he tried a bunch of different diets. He tried a vegetarian diet. He had tried keto diet, and he said, I've always dealt with overeating, not knowing when to stop, because I felt like I never felt full unless I was absolutely miserable. Like I would gorge myself and only stop when I felt pain. It did feel better, but it was also hard to stay on. He's talking about the vegetarian diet, because I do love meat, and I was again feeling deprived. He said, starting around June, I'd heard about the croissant diet and seeing the science and reading about you discussing the French people's diet, it seemed to make so much sense. He said, so I bought some of the stearic acid butter, or stearic acid from my website, and said he started using it with ghee. He bought cocoa butter. He's been trying to avoid soy for years, but now he's trying to stay from all sources of pupa. And he says, so he was eating pancakes and syrup, bagels cooked in, pancakes cooked in the high stearic acid butter, which is one of the things I did in my croissant diet. Bagels cooked in stearic acid butter with grass-fed cream cheese, or oil-free bread toasted in stearic acid butter, or even butter croissants he buys in the supermarket. And he says, with that, and he's eating 3 meals a day, and he says, the biggest thing I love about this diet is I don't feel deprived, and it has essentially ended my cravings for a lot of foods. If I don't eat lunch on time, it's okay, I can wait a little longer, or if I'm eating, I get a steak and mashed potatoes with extra butter, and I'm fine. He says, also, I love that I get all the benefits of keto, no retained water, no swelling, no inflammation, sore joints, and I still get to eat carbs. My weight used to fluctuate 7 to sometimes 10 pounds a day, depending on how much pure or carbs I had. Now it's a pound at the most. My energy for bike riding is through the roof. I don't get hungry as fast, and my mile times have gotten better with less fatigue at a calorie deficit. It's absolutely amazing. The weight is now just melting off of me, and I'm not even trying to limit myself. It's impossible to overeat. I now know what it means to eat until I'm full. In fact, my body self-regulated the other day. I usually eat 4 pancakes with syrup, and one day that was way too much food. I had to reduce my eating on my own. Thank you for putting the diet out there. I'm not going back. And so, and so that's why I think is interesting is what one of the things, and obviously this is a low carb show, so I'm not here to promote carbs, but one of the things that I found is that the key thing for me is getting enough saturated fat. And one of the things that using some carbohydrates do is it helps you to get them down palatably, And so I find, and I think this is interesting. So I find that I can eat by the time, so all right, if I make something like a croissant or brioche, I make them very high in fat in the first place. So they're already like 70% of calories from fat, and then I spread extra butter on them. So by the time I eat them, it's like 80% of the calories are still from fat, and I can eat, I can eat 50 grams of carbs in a meal for dinner or more, or 100 grams of carbs in a meal at dinner, and be back in ketosis the next morning. And so what I'm finding is that there's this kind of magical ratio where you can sort of like saturate the starch with saturated fat, and I end up eating so little starch that way, even though my meals are, quote, starch-based, that I go into ketosis between meals anyway. So in a lot of ways, the croissant diet is a low-carb diet, even though I'm using starch as a delivery vessel for the saturated fat. So that's a little.
Well,
that's
plus you're releasing that sugar slowly, so you're not getting that mass rush at one time too. Just like if you're having, there's things with if you eat carbs after your protein source or your fat source, it doesn't release as quickly, so you're not going to see the spikes. But what I'm curious about is to see, based on the energy model that we're seeing, is okay, if I have a diabetic and they eat more saturated fat, stearic acid, and I block that sugar from leaving the bloodstream, my concern as a doc is I'm going to see higher blood sugars, right? Unless they're exercising and burning that off, because that's going to remain in the system, right? So that is
right.
Not to see. I don't think we've ever looked at that, but that would be an interesting, and plus I have people with continuous glucose monitor, so I can see what's happening with their glucose levels. But it will be actually very interesting to see, because part of that is, and I've been debating this with my guy who has diabetes, because his sugars are still running high in the morning because he's kicking out. But because he doesn't eat anything until 11, as soon as he eats, his sugar drop, right? So I'm thinking if he had like a bulletproof coffee or something like that, or something with more saturated fat in the morning, I would maybe see a sugar drop, because the gluconeogenesis problem, right, of kicking out sugar from his liver to give him energy for the day. If he has a fat source of energy, that may shut part of that down. So I don't know what it's going to be, but I'm curious to see what happens with that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does make sense. And I've noticed that, so when I'm doing this diet, I stay fairly, what's the word? I didn't even want to say insulin resistant, because I think it's really controlled more by the Randall cycle, whether or not your muscle cells want to uptake glucose. So if you're burning a lot of fat, and you get in, and I'm kind of switching this up just to try something different, but I was doing a thing where I was eating a meal with a lot of saturated fat, and then I was fasting for a while. And that was pretty effective at weight loss. But one of the things I think about that is you do in that long gap, you get into fat burning mode, right? And then when you're in real fat burning mode, your body doesn't necessarily want to use glucose very efficiently. So I find when I eat a big combined meal of, with 100 grams of glucose or whatever, my blood glucose does go up pretty high sometimes, because my body, none of my tissues are really wanting the glucose. But I don't know, I don't know how much I care about that, to be honest. If in the morning my fasting blood glucose is fine, I feel like having that little bit of a glucose spike after dinner is one of the things that actually kind of makes me feel more satiated at the end of the meal, because a lot of satiation, it's supposed to happen in the hypothalamus. And one of the things that drives satiation in the hypothalamus, much like which drives the insulin resistance in the fat cell, is the generation of reactive oxygen species in the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus also has the LPL, so your dietary fat is directed to the hypothalamus. But I think the hypothalamus is sort of looking at overall energy availability. So I think if you're reasonably metabolically healthy, and I think if the hypothalamus is seeing high saturated fat and high glucose at the same time, I think it's wanting to signal at that point satiety. So I've been wondering if, and I don't have any real data for this. It's been what I've been thinking is that by adding some of the carbs back to my diet and having that high blood glucose after a meal, it'll stay elevated for, several hours, that maybe that's helping me feel that satiation, but I'm just guessing based on my experience, and based on the experience that, that Jay, whose email I just read, has said the same thing, that perhaps a little bit of carbohydrate might actually help with post-meal satiation.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be an individual variation. I think we all have to look at that. And like you said, if some people can't debond whatever the saturated fat, then this may not be the way to go for those people, right? Because adding more saturated fat and may make it more difficult for them, or whatever. I don't know.
Right, and there was a woman on Twitter who had actually tried the croissant diet and the stearic acid and had a very bad experience with it. And then just recently, she kind of figured out what was giving her, her metabolic problems. And it turns out she has a genetic deficiency in her ability to use long chain saturated fats. And so, and that's a very rare thing, but for her, that has been her problem. It turns out, but she didn't know that at the time. So, by attempting to do the croissant diet, she was doing the exact thing that her body, trying to do the exact thing that her body can't do. So it was just a mismatch, right, of genetics and diet. And so I think that happens a lot, right? And that maybe that's why there's not always a one size fits all situation for everybody. But
yeah, man, Brad, this is awesome stuff. It is eye opening. I think it's something we have to look at clinically and observe. So I'm going to do some observation with this. Obviously, I can't really recommend it for people until I mess with myself a little bit trying it out, because I've really cut back on saturated fat. I cut the fat off my steak and that stuff, and I'm thinking about it now, thinking, have I done myself a disservice being overweight my entire life? And I'm having success, but it's slow success the last few months. So I'm like, okay, I'm stepping up the exercise and things like that. So, man, I think it's exciting what you're doing, and I think a lot of people in the keto community are eating a lot of pork, and it may not be the best for them. So your products, and obviously I don't have any financial interest in it, but I like to promote people who can help people. So tell people how they get in touch. Oh, and before that, I don't think you answered my question with regard to like looking at like the coffees in the morning. If people are going to add, so because people are going to listen and go, okay, so what do I do? Do I put MCT in my coffee? Do I put heavy whipping cream? Do I put butter? Do I put stearic acid? Like if people say, look, I like to do a bulletproof coffee type thing, or fat bombs, do you say, yeah, add a little stearic acid here, or don't add it, just do butter? What do you think is the approach?
I mean, I've never been a fat in my coffee person, so I don't have a lot of personal experience to add to this. I have had people, what I would say is, don't put straight stearic acid into your coffee, because the melting point is 170 degrees, which means it might melt if your coffee is very high, but as soon as it touches your lips, you're going to have wax lips, because at body temperature, it is absolutely as hard as candle wax. So if you want to try stearic acid in your coffee, what you should do is you should follow my recipe and melt the stearic acid first into a fat with a lower melting point, like butter or coconut oil or something like that. You could also try, another thing people have done in their coffee is cocoa butter. Cocoa butter tastes nice. It kind of has a chocolatey flavor. It's another one that's very high in stearic acid and low in polyunsaturated fats. Like I say, that it's pretty good in coffee, so that's an option. And I've had some people that report they've been using it in coffee, and it helps with their satiation levels. But it's not something I'm a chef. I like to
it's not your thing.
cook meals and eat meals, so I don't I don't have a lot of personal experience to share with those kinds of questions, but. Yeah, I guess, like with everything, right? Give it a shot, see if it works for you, or see what works for you. The stearic acid, once you try cooking with it, it is a funny thing, because if you use too much of it in anything, you're just going to be eating wax.
Yeah, exactly, right. Yeah, exactly. So, hey, how do people get in touch with you? How do people find
So
your meat, and you ship all over? How's that work?
Yeah, so the blog is Fire in a Bottle. It's just fireinabottle.net, all one word. If you Google for Fire in a Bottle, it comes up, or just Google the croissant diet, and that comes up as well. A lot of good science on there. I'm pretty active on Twitter, so fire_bottle is my Twitter handle. You can follow me on Twitter. There's a great discussion forum on all of these topics on Reddit, which is r/saturated fat. So, follow along with the discussion on Reddit. And the meat company is called firebrandmeats.com, and we are really pushing the limits of how we're making pork that is going to essentially have fat that is exactly like beef fat, like the same level of saturation as beef fat. And we're doing that with a very special diet and special breeds of pigs. And I'm super excited. And so that is that's kind of a subscription model, because I didn't have enough money to grow the first batch of pigs. And so people are signing up for a share, and they pay a month ahead, and then you get the share. We are just on the first batch of pigs. We'll probably be out into the world before this podcast even comes out. But they're going to be go to the slaughterhouse a month from yesterday, so I'm very excited about that. And so, I'm hoping to build that model and keep getting subscribers. But that's kind of a moving, it's a very tricky thing to pull off all the logistics, but it is shipping everywhere in the US. Share boxes, basically $100 a month. You can get a box every month, or you can get one every other month or every third month. And I think the pork quality is just going to be fantastic. They're Berkshire pigs, which is just a great breed of pig for meat quality. It's got marbling. As you can tell, I'm very excited about this product, and I just want to keep it going and keep talking about this issue, because I think it is a problem, how we feed our animals.
Man, awesome work you're doing, and I'm excited. I have a couple questions on exiting, because it's going to bug me.
Sure.
Your before picture, you had this really nice fish. Has losing the weight affected your fishing skills? I don't see any post weight loss fish catching.
I think just being busy is affecting my fishing game, but I do love fishing, and typically I'm so busy right now. The last several years in October, I've driven out to Montauk to go striper fishing on the beach, which is one of my all-time favorite things to do. I don't know if I'm going to be able to make that trip this year, between all the COVID restrictions and just being quite busy at the moment. I like to get out there anytime I can.
Well, my last question for you. My brother was dating someone in Wisconsin, and he went to the family farm. And it was funny because the cows were all there eating and doing their thing. And when he walked up, they all stopped and stared at him like, who's this guy? Like, they recognized he didn't belong there. And so they go, can you just move out of the way so they can eat? And then they started eating again as soon as he left. But how are the pigs? Are the pigs, do they know you and they come up to you and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah. I mean, they spook when they hear loud noises and they all run, but they're also very curious. So they come right back, and they recognize the sound of, like, if we feed them with the tractor, when they hear the tractor, that's a trigger to them to come running, because the fresh feed is going to get put down. Pigs are a lot of fun, just in general. I enjoy spending time with them. They're great. Part of me has always wanted to have a pet pig that lives in the house, but I think in reality that's a disastrous idea. But I love their personalities. So if I could have one hang out with me here on the couch, I would. But that would, and some people have pigs in their houses, but that would be, it's probably not a great idea. Very destructive animals.
They love too, man. They're big, dang animals.
They love chewing. They love chewing and rubbing. They kind of make art, we call it, in the barns. It's like we have these like 6x6 posts that come down, and they rub so much that the wood gets like polished and like rounded.
Oh,
so
yeah.
They kind of have their own art style that they do. They're rubbing against the wood.
Well, that might be your second business on the side.
Yeah.
But it's great. But I think that's important for people to hear. Look, that you're humanely raising animals, that you care for them, and you're making sure they're providing for you, and you're providing for them, and it's all part of the cycle. And I think a lot of us miss that. There's these big slaughterhouses and all that stuff, but that human touch of people just don't understand what it's like to be on a ranch and to see the animals grow, and seeing cows out in the fields and all that kind of stuff. So it's pretty awesome, and I think a lot of us really, I wish we had more of that locally. But it's awesome, the service you're providing, and I'm really excited about the science that you're. And obviously you have an open invitation. I would love to hear you down the road, 6 months, 4 months. What do we learn down the road of longevity and testimonies from people and things like that, because I think we have to keep an open mind and learn. So Brad, thanks so much for joining me, man. Really appreciate it. Tro's gonna be bummed you missed this one.
Thanks for having me. And we'll talk soon. I'd love to come back on and chat with Tro as well. So
yeah, we'll give you a little more notice than last time. I just called you last night or emailed you. I go, hey, I want to talk to you about this, because clinically I'm really intrigued by what you're doing, and I really want to help people the best way I can. I think that you are adding to the our database of knowledge, and I think we just have to look at that. So hey, everyone, thank you for listening. I know we went a little long, but this is really an intriguing topic I think we need to think about. So like always, we say talk to your doctor, discuss it with your health professionals. We're not your physician, but we are raising questions and looking at our clinical experience. So hopefully it helps you in guiding you towards getting more knowledge. And I think this was really a great step in that way. So thank you all. Have a great week and be kind to each other and stay safe.